Welcome to our backyard. This is the Backyard Philosophy Podcast. We are two friends having a discussion after everyone else has passed out or gone to bed. Grab a drink and listen as we discuss everything from automation, space exploration, and why the meaning of life is 42. We're going to talk about the history of gun laws, gun restrictions, gun regulations in the United States of America. We're not going to talk about the world because it's a broad place. Everyone's different. The U.S. gets most of the news anyway, and that's where I live. Before we get too far into it, this is not legal advice. We're going to talk about some laws that happened in the past. This is more of a historical look, and it's not encompassing every single law because, well, each state, commonwealth, colony had a different law, federal. It's a lot to look at. So I'm going to hit some of the high points, and then if I miss anything, let us know. Some stuff I may have omitted just because a state did it already, and I didn't want to talk about it twice. But there's a lot of interesting stories out there, and hopefully we're going to talk about a few of them. Before we get into it, Mike, how are you doing? What are you drinking?
Well, I absolutely love how you chose a person whose driver's license says Texan on it, who's drinking some tin cup whiskey to talk about gun laws. So this is going to be an interesting episode, but what about you, my friend? What are you drinking and how are you doing?
I am doing great. I got some Blue Moon. I got the orange in it. I'm trying really hard to pretend it's summer outside. It is not. But yeah, so full disclosure, both of us may or may not be pro firearms, but we're going to try and remain as impartial as we can. And this is more about history than anything else. So the first gun regulation, you could call it, that took place in the colonies was in 1619 in Virginia.
Before the formation of the United States.
Yeah, before the formation of the United States. So we're going to set the stage. So the first General Assembly of Virginia met to enact some laws that would help the 11 colonies live together. And one of those was a gun control law, which said that no man shall sell any Indian any piece, shot, or powder, or any other arms offensive or defensive upon pain of being held a traitor to the colony and of being hanged as soon as that fact is proven without all redemption.
Well, that's very biased right off the bat.
Yeah, the first gun law is that you cannot sell any firearms to Indians. And furthermore, in 1619, they also passed, I don't know if you would call this a gun regulation, but it is a firearm pertaining law. They passed a fine on any able-bodied man who failed to come armed to church on the Sabbath or any other public place. So if you're going out with your family to whatever, a town meeting or anything, any able-bodied man had to come armed. And that was to do two things, not only to let all the Native Americans know that all the houses were empty of firearms, and if you went and robbed a house, there's no firearms there, but also to provide protection for everyone traveling to and from public events.
That is a very interesting law, and I actually don't know how I feel about that. One, bad for assuming the Native Americans would break into your house and steal your guns. But to make sure you're always armed and ready to defend yourself, not the worst idea. So a little bit of column A, a little column B there, Nick.
Yeah, well, it's not a friendly time. It's you have to defend yourself, but is it right to make it mandatory to do that?
Probably not.
Probably not. So the next laws come up in 1640. The Virginia slave codes prohibited all free mulattoes and Negroes from bearing arms. And not too long after that, other states followed. And this was probably in response to a lot of slave revolts that were taking place in the Caribbean, which I'll touch on, but we're not going to get into because it only affects firearm legislation in America in the sense that it scared and prompted some more restrictive laws. In 1676, we had several slave rebellions. One of them was Bacon's Rebellion, and that one was interesting because it wasn't just people of color. It was also white indentured servants. If you're not familiar, poor people from Europe would come as indentured servants, and basically the people who were indentured to would raise the price, and they'd just be stuck in this loop of, you're going to work for me until you're free, until you paid off your debt to me, but then they'd charge them for shit or whatever, and basically another form of slavery. And so Bacon's Rebellion, it was the white indentured servitudes and the slaves who got firearms together and rebelled. And then in response to that, the government rolled out more slave laws. And this is surprising to me. I'm sure this was a rule, but not an actual law at this point. One of them is that people of color were not able to get or own firearms. That makes sense. If you don't want your slaves to rebel, you would prevent them from owning firearms.
Yeah, it's weird though. I definitely different time periods, that's for sure.
Yep. And as tensions rose, as this time the slave revolts were going on in the Caribbean, colonies were getting more and more scared of a slave revolt, and so they started requiring, similar to the Virginia law about Indians, required head of households to own guns, and that able-bodied men enroll in the militia and carry personal firearms. Now, this is interesting because when this law doesn't specify able-bodied men, it just says head of households, and that included women. So if it was like a woman who lived by herself, she was required to own a firearm. But I don't think, I couldn't find for certain, but I'm pretty sure she was not responsible, was not mandated to be enrolled in the militia.
Hey, give anyone a scatter gun, all of a sudden they're a dangerous weapon.
Yep. And slave revolts continued to happen, and different states passed more laws about taking your firearm with you, and that same thing intended to provide for your safety, but also that you wouldn't leave your house with all your slaves and a bunch of guns there. In 1743, the South Carolina law stated you had to remove your firearm to prevent Native Americans' theft of firearms from unattended homes and safeguard against insurrections and other wicked attempts of Negroes and other slaves. Furthermore, other laws also had a requirement that anyone immigrating must own a firearm in order to own land.
I was actually just going to ask that. Do these laws only apply to landowners, or is it just everyone in the territory?
That's a good question. I want to say it probably only applies to landowners, but I didn't really look into that too much, so that one's up in the air. Don't take my word for it. So this was kind of funny and not that surprising. Well, not really funny, but seems like an obvious thing that should have been anticipated. In 1739 in South Carolina, the planter class, the white planter class, was getting more and more worried by all the number of slave uprisings. And so they thought they would pass the Security Act, which would mandate that the white planter class would carry muskets to church with them on Sundays, kind of like we talked about, pretty common for the time. But while that was going into effect, people weren't doing it. So the slaves, obviously hearing about this going into effect, decided, hey, if we want to have a rebellion, we should do it before they're required to carry all their guns to church. And so what did they do? They rebelled on a Sunday when they knew their owners were at church and all their guns were at home. So they went into the house, took all the guns, and started killing people and recruiting more slaves from different plantations. They eventually were killed. It's called Stono's Rebellion. And because of this uprising, more and more states got more scared of uprisings. As each uprising happens, restrictions tighter. It's just like Princess Leia talking to Darth Vader. The more you tighten your grasp, the more star systems slip through your fingers. So as you get harsher, the more people want to get out.
I mean, I can't blame them. That makes sense to me. If I'm going to rebel, that seems like the perfect opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I mean, how stupid do you have to be to let's have a date in the future, because we know that this could happen, but we're not worried about it until we have to.
Well, when date did you say this was? 1786?
1739.
1739. They're still doing leeching at this point as a cure. So, yeah. I don't even know if they've discovered microorganisms at this point.
Yep. So another different kind of gun law. In 1771, certain states, well, colonies, moved to enact laws that restricted certain dangerous, unusual weapons. This is probably one of the first laws more similar to our current firearm laws than anything. So basically, it outlawed things like sort of like a concealed carry law. Like you couldn't have a gun that you fired from a string that was hidden inside your boot or some shit like that. Basically, it said you couldn't.
Like no like cane guns, no
You
hidden
couldn't
guns.
be. Yeah, you couldn't be. The practice of rigging firearms to be fired with a string or similar method to discharge a weapon without an actual finger on the firearm trigger, and these were referred to as gun traps. And these are spring guns and infernal machines. So
I hate to interrupt here, but I want to know why that laws came to existence. Like who was doing it enough where they go, all right, this is enough. We need laws for this.
yeah, well, we'll get into the Supreme Court case. Can't remember exactly which one. There's two we're going to talk about where there was the cane sword. So we'll touch back on these strange weapons in a minute. So we're people's the next obvious date as we move up the date, December 15th, 1791, the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was ratified. So I think we're all familiar with the Second Amendment, but I will read it out for everyone just to reiterate the whole thing. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So that's the Second Amendment, and I'm going to touch on it a little bit just to say people talk a lot about gun restrictions in America and the history of it, and a lot of them talk about the restrictions that were in place by England on the United States. I'm specifically not talking about those because those weren't self-imposed restrictions.
Yeah, foreign government on telling other people how to live.
You know, someone who you're worried about fighting you're going to take their guns away. So that's why I didn't include them. There are many examples of that. Many of those led to the American Revolution. There's a disclaimer. I didn't forget about them. I just purposely omitted them. So there's other smaller gun laws that different colonies, states at this time passed. Most of them just prohibited the use of banning trade with Native Americans or indentured servants or slaves from owning guns. They also had exemptions for certain occupations. So like we talked about, where you had to own a gun to go to a public meeting, or head of households had to own a gun. If you were a certain profession, you wouldn't have to own a gun. I think the best example would be a lawyer wouldn't have to own a gun. Something that gets brought up a lot too is it's a quote from a recent president that you couldn't just own a cannon during the Revolutionary War. Well, it turns out you can.
Oh, that I was gonna say, Nick, I want to own a cannon. Don't say that.
Yeah. So that was not true because, one, there is no legislation on the books that said you couldn't own a cannon. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. One, not very few people would own cannons, so there's no need for legislation. The other thing, too, and people say, well, just because they're so cost prohibitive, people couldn't own them, and we look at how much effort Washington spent to get cannons from place to place and steel cannons and all this. They were rare in the colonies, but people did have them. Another thing to look at is all the American privateers. Those were their own cannons, and there was no law prohibiting them from owning those cannons. So if there's one thing you take away from this, it's that you can own cannons. In 1792, a federal law was passed that required every man eligible for militia service to own a gun and ammunition suitable for military service. Not only that, but they had to report for frequent inspection of their guns and register his gun ownership on public records. Now, this is commonly thrown out to say, oh, look, gun registrations is as old as the country, 1792. That's true. This was more, I think, a purpose of keeping a roster for the militia, but there's not as much on this. Mostly this piece seems like it's just used as a talking point more than the history around it. I'd like to learn more about it, but not much came up besides, look, I told you so. Very few of firearm laws nowadays involve militias, so that's why I point that out. All right, so here you go. Mike, I got a Supreme Court case you might enjoy here. 1822, Bliss versus the Commonwealth was charged with carrying a concealed sword and a cane. Because it was concealed, it could be a danger, so they're trying to they had an anti-concealed carry, well, what we would consider an anti-concealed carry law. And so they went to federal court. The Supreme Court said that you can't prohibit him from carrying concealed because you're denying him the right to defend himself, so that prohibiting concealed weapons is against the Constitution, and the law was nullified, and Bliss was allowed to carry his concealed sword and a cane.
That kind of makes me happy. It's like, I understand you want to know a present and immediate danger, but at the same time, you also don't want to flaunt it and be out as in public about it. So there is definitely a middle ground, and I think a cane sword should definitely be allowed.
I mean, he's already carrying a cane. Like, how much of a danger, you know? Let him have a cane sword. So the next one, going back into the state Supreme Court, 1837, Georgia passed a law banning handguns. The law was then ruled unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court and was thrown out. So now we're getting into the slave codes, or the black codes, later the Jim Crow laws. And people refer to these laws kind of together, even though they span a lot of time, because they all have a similar purpose. They prohibited people of color from owning guns, and they prohibited allowing the ownership of guns for specified quote-unquote free white men. So an example would be a Georgia law stated, "It shall not be lawful for any free person of color in the state to own, use, or carry firearms of any description whatever, that the person free of color so detected in owning, using, or carrying a firearm shall receive upon his bare back 39 lashes, and the firearm so found in the possession of said free person of color shall be exposed for public sale." So even if you were free, if you were a person of color and you were freed, you still weren't allowed to own a firearm.
Yeah, this is still very foreign to me. To me, it's freedom for all or freedom for none. It's just, again, the context of this time period is the Emancipation Proclamation hasn't really happened. Equal rights has not exactly happened. It's weird to think about when looking at these laws on who they were focusing against and for.
And this is not completely pertinent to what's going on in the U.S. right now, but I thought it was an interesting parallel of eras of massive gun buying. So during COVID, the U.S. experienced an unprecedented amount of new gun ownership. Similar to in 1850s, there was a huge amount of new gun ownership by African Americans because the South passed the federal government passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that Southerners could chase slaves into the North. And so then African Americans were responsible, or their response was to purchase firearms and defend themselves. Frederick Douglass went on record saying that blacks should carry a good revolver. And part of that is that the Fugitive Slave Act was so loosely worded that basically you come up from the South, kidnap any person of color, bring them back and say is an escaped slave. So it's your word against theirs in the South. So not
good fucking
a chance
luck.
You're willing to take. Yeah. So and it spurned a lot of firearm purchases and a lot of donations. A lot of northern, citizens donated their firearms to black families in their area.
That makes me happy to hear.
Response to the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1857, the Dred Scott case, another famous Supreme Court case. So it was basically, the Dred Scott case was about the citizenship and question of a slave who, trying to not explain the whole thing, but lived in a free state with his master, kind of moved around, and it was this case of if he's free or not. And basically, it's ruled as one of the worst Supreme Court cases ever. And what the ruling judge said basically is that we can't give this man. I'll read a part of it. Denied citizenship to black people in part because granting citizenship would give to persons of the Negro race full liberty, and that included to keep and carry arms wherever they went. So we can't rule that this man is free because that would entail him access to all the freedoms, and that includes a bunch of other stuff he listed, voting and all that stuff. But the one I think was probably important is keep and carry arms. People don't want escaped slaves to own firearms because then they can defend themselves. People, if we've learned one thing so far, it's that the government doesn't like people who it's trying to control to own guns, whether that be Native Americans or people of color, or indentured servants, the Irish, pretty much anyone who's not in the ruling class at the time.
Yeah, it seems a lot of rules for thee and rules for me, not for me.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. So the Civil War. The Civil War exposed a lot of people of color to firearms who maybe didn't have access or the knowledge before. A lot of people felt uneasy about that. Militias formed, white and black. White militias tried to disarm black militias. The U.S. government tried to step in and stop the white militias, but they weren't very successful, so the black community formed their own militias for their own defense. And they kind of went back and forth, fighting each other. The white militias would show up on someone's house to take their guns, do whatever, and the black militia would follow and defend them, and they'd get in a fight. And, series of skirmishes took place all over the country. And then you also have, at this time, gun bans took place in the 1860s. So basically, this was one of the first category bans. So most of them were pistols. So you had Arkansas, Kansas, Texas, different counties in Tennessee and Wyoming banned all firearms. That included both handguns and long guns from any city, town, or village. And then Arkansas banned the sale of transfer of pistols, except for military use. Most of these, all this is post-Civil War era. States are trying to figure out how do we quell this violence. There's violence that took place after the Civil War. People were unhappy. The whole Reconstruction era. Let's take the guns away. Didn't really work that well. Here's a cool story, though. In Arkansas, for 1860s, there's a radical Republican governor and a congressman who were assassinated by white supremacists. And the congressman was assassinated. So the governor raised a predominantly black militia that just went all over Arkansas and got rid of the KKK in the state of Arkansas.
That's pretty dope. They made Texas Rangers, but for Arkansas.
Yep. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, people talk about, well, what do militias really do for you? I'm not saying that every militia is what you're imagining, but that's pretty cool. 1860s, it worked. That's exactly what the founders wanted.
I'm not gonna lie. This seems like a movie. Be like, you know what? We're gonna get rid of these racists. Let's form a militia.
So, of course, you can't have all the fun stuff about guns without the bad. In 1890, the Army came to disarm the Lakota. The details are still unclear exactly what happened, but the story that's out there is that there's a miscommunication from a deaf Lakotan that led to an errant shot when they tried to take his weapon. People heard gunfire and they started a firefight, which became the Wounded Knee Massacre. The Wounded Knee Massacre never would have happened if the government didn't try to disarm the Lakotan. I think Lakotan. The Lakota Nation. Why did the government want to disarm the Lakota? Because, well, it's easier to displace an unarmed population than an armed population. If there's anything that we learned today, it's that. Disarmament is followed by something you don't want. So in 1893, a justice in Florida man, was passed when, quoting here, the original act of 1893 was passed when there was a great influx of Negro laborers in the state drawn here for the purpose of working in turpentine and labor camps. The same condition existed when the act was amended in 1901, and the act was passed for the purpose of disarming the Negro laborers and thereby reduce the unlawful homicides that were prevalent in turpentine and sawmill camps to give the white citizens in sparsely settled areas a better feeling of security. The statute was never intended to be applied to the white population and in practice has never been so applied. I mean, they just went right out and said it.
Yeah, that's kind of on the nose.
So this is where I'm going to draw at the end because this kind of brings us to what I'd call the era of modern firearm laws, which I think differentiate wildly from these previous firearm laws. And I'll talk about a few that are honorable mentions, but February 14th, 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre occurred in Chicago, which I think we all, at least have heard of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Well, that might be for those unfamiliar.
Because we lived in Chicago.
Yeah.
An enemy of Al Capone was killed, and the big takeaway from this is that people didn't like that citizens had access to Tommy guns and quote unquote machine guns, shotguns, short barreled shotguns, silencers. So the National Firearms Act was passed. Originally enacted in 1934, it imposed a $200 tax and a registration requirement on the making and transfer of certain guns, including shotguns and rifles with barrels shorter than 18 inches, quote, short-barreled, machine guns, firearms, mufflers and silencers, and specific firearms labeled as any other weapons by the NFA. The NFA is still in place today, and that's what regulates, well, pretty much everything I just said. What I think is funny is that it's still a $200 tax, which is a lot more money back then, and that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about. One of the things that these states did to prevent people of color, indentured servants, Irish, poor whites from buying firearms is you just have to pay a certain amount of money. Pretty much the ruling class was the ones who were able to afford that much money, which is why it's charging more for this isn't really you're not taking as much off the streets, you're just doing it legally. So making people pay $200 at that time, you're just saying, if you're poor, you can't afford this. But if you have enough money, you can. So this is one of the things, permits, the shall issue. Even today, the shall issue for concealed carry permits tends to support more Caucasians, white people I think it's like something like 90% of concealed carry permit holders are white compared to a smaller percentage that are black. But basically all the permitting, especially shall issue, is a way to say, if I don't like you, I don't have to issue this permit, which that's, as we've seen how these laws have been applied in the past, tends to be racially driven, I guess.
I feel like it's a very old tradition. You simply, if you don't want certain people to have it, you just raise the price so high that only the people you quote unquote want can afford it. That's a page in a book that's very old, and it's kind of disgusting when you think about it, especially with the Valentine Massacre, which I'm surprised I did not know this, Nick, but where the silencers, the permits come from for short barrels and suppressors, but also at the same time, it's really weird that they focus on that, not that the gangsters dressed as cops to shoot other gangsters.
So that's where I'm going to cut off my timeline, but I still have some interesting facts and tidbits I learned along the way. A lot of people are probably wondering, why didn't you talk about the Wild West? Well, it really wasn't that wild, and the laws were all over the place. But talk about it now, pretty much because every town you entered, you had to surrender your firearms. Many states paid for police through taxes on local businesses, usually bars, places to gamble, houses of prostitution. There are prohibitions against carrying guns, and there actually weren't that many, what we'd call a shootout. Even the most violent cow towns of the West, that would be Abilene, Caldwell, Dodge City, Ellsworth, and Wichita. There were only 45 killings between 1870 and 1885, and only 6 of those murders were from 6-shooters. 16 of those were killed by police. So it wasn't the Wild West of our movies, and it really didn't seem to have a huge effect on like our national gun laws or how we view gun laws. So I didn't really think it was pertinent to the conversation, but people are probably wondering. So this is after my timeline, but this is an interesting tidbit talking about the shall issue permits. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the mid-1950s applied for a concealed carry permit in Alabama after his house was firebombed in 1956. The local police, using discretionary licensing policies, denied Dr. King a permit, claiming that he was unsuitable.
How the fuck is Martin Luther King unsuitable for a concealed carry?
Because that's where shall issue gets dirty.
Those motherfuckers.
Another that is past our timeline, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. 1967, the Mulford Act. Reagan prohibited open carry in California. Most Californians would cheer this, but this was in direct response to the Black Panthers open carrying. So it's directly targeted at people of color. So it's kind of a contradiction for the state of California. I'll let them figure that one out. But this has come up a lot, and even though it's not in my timeline, I felt like I should mention it. And another honorable mention, the Japanese during World War II had to be disarmed and give up all their firearms, and were then taken into internment camps. For those of you who don't know who Maj Touré is, he's the founder of Black Guns Matter, a nonprofit that helps African Americans in the inner city get firearms training to help them defend themselves. He had a good quote that I want to end this podcast with. That's, despite being lauded as a progressive necessity, gun control at its core has always been discriminatory against ethnic, political, and religious minorities as well as the poorest members of our society. And that's all I got.
It's amazing how much opinion goes into the laws that dictate everyone.
It's just not the past you thought it was. I don't know. It was surprising. It's interesting to me. It's not exactly what I thought I was going to find, but that's what we got. Thanks for listening to the Backyard Philosophy Podcast. We rarely finish a podcast without missing a point we wanted to bring up, so let us know what we forgot. And if you have a topic you want us to talk about, let us know at Backyard Philosophy on Instagram and Backyard Philosophy Podcast on